In 1917, America was at war, and on the home front, a new kind of soldier was conscripted. They were young women, their fingers nimble, their spirits high, and their futures seemingly bright. At the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, they were tasked with painting luminous watch dials for soldiers in the trenches, a patriotic duty that came with a handsome salary. They were told the glowing paint, a mixture of gum arabic, water, and radium salt, was harmless. To get a finer point on their brushes, they were instructed to use their mouths, a technique they called lip, dip, paint. With every lick, they ingested a small dose of poison. They became known as the Ghost Girls, their hair, skin, and clothes shimmering with an ethereal radioactive dust when they returned home at night. It was a novelty, a party trick. But then, the novelty wore off, and a horror began to set in. The first was Molly Maggia. Her teeth fell out, her jaw disintegrated into a suppurating abscess, her limbs ached with a pain so deep no medicine could touch it. Doctors were baffled, diagnosing her with syphilis to tarnish her name and deflect from the truth. Soon, more girls followed Molly into the grave, their bodies racked by anemia, bone fractures, and sarcomas that consumed them from the inside out. The company denied everything. They hired their own experts to produce studies that declared radium safe, even beneficial to human health. The story of their fight for justice, a landmark case in labor rights history, was eventually told. It was a story of corporate greed and unthinkable suffering. The truth, it was believed, had been uncovered and laid to rest with the bones of the women who glowed until they died. But nearly a century later, in the skeletal remains of the long-condemned factory, a different kind of truth lay waiting in the dark. The factory was a carcass picked clean by time and scavengers, a concrete skeleton slowly being crushed by the relentless embrace of nature. Weeds grew like green fissures in the foundation, and rust bled from every iron fixture. It was a place of ghosts, not just of the women who had died there, but of an industry that had promised a miracle and delivered a curse. To Leo, it was a cathedral of decay. An urban explorer with a historian's soul, he moved through the ruins with a quiet reverence, his camera capturing the poetry of its collapse. He had explored dozens of sites like this, but this one felt different. The air was heavy, still, carrying a strange, metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. He knew the stories, the warnings of residual radiation, but the pull of the forgotten was stronger than the fear of the unseen. It was in a collapsed section of the sub-basement, a place the initial demolition crews had missed, that he found it. A section of the floor had given way, revealing a small, brick-lined cavity. Inside sat a heavy, lead-lined box, its surface dull and strangely cold to the touch. It was not a corporate safe. It was too small, too personal. With a grunt of effort, he pried the lid open. There was no treasure inside, no radium-laced artifacts. There was only a single, thick leather-bound ledger. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but still legible. The script was precise, elegant, the writing of a man of science. It was a journal, filled with chemical formulas, observational notes, and dates spanning from 1921 to 1924. Leo's breath caught in his chest. He saw names: Amelia, Catherine, Grace, the famous names from the court cases. But there were other names, too. Dozens of them, listed under a heading that made no sense. Control Group B, Enhanced Phosphor. He flipped to the final entry, dated December 12, 1924. The handwriting was different here. Jagged, panicked. He knows. Roeder knows what the new mixture does. He called the accelerated necrosis a resounding success. They are not subjects. They are disposable. I can no longer be a part of this. God forgive me. Below the text was a single, dark brown smear, a fingerprint that looked suspiciously like dried blood. This was not a record of corporate negligence. This was a confession. Leo, feeling the weight of the book in his hands, knew he had stumbled upon a story far darker than the one the world already knew. He carefully placed the ledger in his pack, the silence of the factory pressing in on him, now feeling less like a cathedral and more like a tomb. Dr. Evelyn Reed held the ledger in her gloved hands, the chill of its lead-lined box seeming to seep into the sterile environment of her university office. As a medical historian, she had built her career on the cold, hard facts of occupational disease, tracing the lines from industrial innovation to human suffering. The Radium Girls were a cornerstone of her field, a foundational tragedy. The story was, she had thought, complete. A tale of hubris, greed, and a dawning, terrible awareness. But the pages in front of her suggested a deliberate, calculated evil that went beyond mere negligence. She had thanked the young explorer, Leo, for his astonishing find and his discretion, assuring him the university would handle it with the gravity it deserved. Now, alone with the words of the long-dead scientist, a man who signed his name as Dr. Alastair Finch, a gnawing unease took hold. She read through the entries, her initial academic curiosity slowly curdling into horror. Finch's early notes mirrored the accepted narrative, concerns about the girls' health, suggestions for safety protocols, all of them dismissed by management. But then came the shift. The entries from mid-1922 onwards were different. They were colder, more detached. He began to write about Control Group B. The names listed were not the familiar Irish and Italian surnames of the primary dial painters. These were different: Polish, Czech, Russian. Immigrant girls new to the country, less likely to have a support network, less likely to be missed. The anomaly that unraveled everything was his description of the enhanced phosphor. He detailed a modified radium paint, one with a secondary, more aggressive isotope blended in. He didn't name it, only referred to its increased luminosity and accelerated biological uptake. Evelyn's blood ran cold. This wasn't a case of the company ignoring the dangers of their product. This was a case of them creating a second, more lethal product and secretly testing it on a select group of their most vulnerable employees. It was a human experiment. The official story was a lie, not in its essence, but in its scope. The known tragedy was a cover for an even greater one. Her mind flashed to a faded photograph on her mantelpiece at home. Her great-great-aunt, Sophia, a young woman with hopeful eyes who had worked in a watch factory in Illinois in the 1920s. She had died young, the cause of death listed on her certificate as a blood disorder. It was a vague, meaningless term her family had never questioned. Evelyn had always suspected a connection to the radium industry, a feeling, an intuition that the problem was more widespread than the handful of famous cases. Now, Finch's ledger gave that intuition a terrifying new form. What if her aunt wasn't just a victim of a dangerous workplace, but part of a larger, unrecorded experiment? The thought was a spur, transforming her professional interest into a deeply personal quest. She trusted her instincts, the gut feeling that had guided her through labyrinthine archives and contradictory historical records before. The world thought it knew the story of the Radium Girls. Evelyn Reed, holding the confession of a tormented scientist, knew it had only read the preface. The real story, the one about the women deliberately chosen to die faster, was screaming to be told from the pages of this ledger. She had to give them a voice. The accepted history, the memorialized tragedy, was about to be broken wide open, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the institution that had buried this truth would not give it up without a fight. The investigation had begun. The first step was to anchor the ghosts. Evelyn spent days cross-referencing the names from Alastair Finch's Control Group B with every available public record: census data, ship manifests, city directories from the 1920s. It was painstaking, frustrating work. Many of the names were common. Others were likely anglicized or misspelled. They were phantoms in the paperwork of the past. But slowly, a few began to emerge from the ether. Lena Spark, a 19-year-old from Czechoslovakia. Anya Nowak, 21, from Poland. They appeared in the 1920 census, living in crowded boarding houses in Orange, their occupation listed as laborer, manufacturing. By 1925, they were gone. No marriage records, no forwarding addresses, no death certificates under those names. They had simply vanished from the official narrative of life. To find them, she knew she had to go to the source. She drove to Orange, New Jersey, the the modern suburban landscape doing little to mask the radioactive scars of its past. Her destination was the Orange Public Library, its archives a repository of the town's collective memory. The head archivist was a woman named Eleanor Vance, sharp-eyed and 70, a gatekeeper of local history who had seen her share of sensationalist authors and morbid curiosity seekers. Initially, Eleanor was guarded, offering Evelyn the standard files on the U.S. Radium Corporation, the newspaper clippings about the famous court case led by Grace Fryer. "It was a terrible tragedy," Eleanor said, her voice polished by 1,000 retellings. "A triumph of justice in the end, for some of them at least." Evelyn waited, letting the silence hang in the dusty air. "I'm not interested in the women who won," she said softly. "I'm looking for the ones who were erased." She pushed a list of names from Finch's ledger across the table. Lena Spark. Anya Nowak. Eleanor stared at the names, her professional veneer cracking just for a second. A flicker of something, recognition, or perhaps fear, crossed her face. I've never seen these names on any official victim manifest," she said, her voice now a cautious whisper. "But my grandmother, she worked in the kitchens at the factory for a short time. She used to talk about them. Not by name, but she called them the Shadow Girls. The ones who got sick fastest. They'd be there 1 week, vibrant and laughing, and gone the next. The company always had a story. They went home to the old country. They got married and moved away." Eleanor leaned forward, lowering her voice further. "My grandmother said the foreman told them not to ask questions. It was better for everyone." The archivist's testimony was the first thread connecting Finch's scientific horror story to the lived experience of the time. The Shadow Girls were real. Why was it never reported? Evelyn pressed. Why didn't their families come forward? Eleanor sighed, a heavy, weary sound. These girls were alone. Their families were thousands of miles away, separated by an ocean and a language barrier. And here the company was everything. It was the town's biggest employer. Even after the scandal, its legacy, it continued. She hesitated. "You should be careful. The U.S. Radium Corporation is long gone, but the Sterling Foundation for Scientific Advancement rose from its ashes. They're headquartered just a few towns over. Immense wealth, immense power. They've spent millions building a reputation for philanthropy and cutting-edge research. They don't like people digging into the uglier parts of their family tree." Here it was. The antagonist, hidden in plain sight, wrapped in a cloak of respectability. The Sterling Foundation. The modern face of Arthur Roeder's monstrous enterprise. Evelyn felt a chill. The Foundation wasn't just a successor company. It was the guardian of the original sin, and she was about to knock on its very well-fortified door. Eleanor, seeing the determination in Evelyn's eyes, seemed to make a decision. She stood up and walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. "The official records won't help you," she said, her back to Evelyn. "But maybe the unofficial ones will." She returned with a box of uncatalogued ephemera, church bulletins, social club rosters, handwritten ledgers from local grocers. "If your girls were here," she said, "some piece of their life might be in here. Godspeed, Dr. Reed. You're going to need it." Evelyn knew that a direct assault on the Sterling Foundation would be fruitless. They would circle the wagons, bury her in legal threats, and discredit her before she could even present her case. She needed to approach them from an angle to use their polished corporate image against them. Posing as a historian conducting a broad study on early 20th century industrial philanthropy, she scheduled a meeting. The Sterling Foundation headquarters was a monument to modern power, a sleek glass and steel structure set on a sprawling, manicured campus. It exuded wealth, progress, and an almost clinical cleanliness that stood in stark contrast to the decaying factory where her investigation had begun. She was met by Mr. Davies, the Foundation's chief historian and director of legacy. He was exactly as she'd imagined, impeccably dressed, with a warm, practiced smile and eyes that remained cool and assessing. He led her to a private museum within the building, a brightly lit space dedicated to the Foundation's history. "We believe in transparency," Davies began, his voice smooth as polished marble. "We don't shy away from the difficult parts of our past. The story of the United States Radium Corporation is a cautionary tale, one we have learned from. He gestured to a display. It featured photographs of the dial painters, quotes from the court case, and panels detailing the company's unwitting role in the tragedy. It was the accepted narrative, packaged and presented as a testament to the Foundation's ethical evolution. Arthur Roeder and his board were men of their time. Davies explained, the perfect corporate apologist. The dangers of radium were simply not understood. Once the evidence became undeniable, the company moved to compensate the victims, and its assets later formed the seed of this very foundation, a way to atone for that ignorance by advancing science for the good of humanity. Evelyn listened, a cold fury building behind her calm facade. Ignorance. The word was a shield, a carefully constructed lie that Finch's ledger shattered into a million pieces. I've come across some inconsistencies in my research, Evelyn said, keeping her tone academic and non-confrontational. Company records from the period are often incomplete. I was hoping you might have more detailed employment logs, perhaps from some of the lesser-known departments. Davies' smile didn't falter, but a subtle tension entered his posture. Our archives are quite comprehensive, Dr. Reed. We can certainly provide you with access to the sanitized records we make available for public study. Sanitized. The word hung in the air between them. I'm particularly interested, Evelyn pressed gently, in the development of different paint formulas. Were there variations in the luminous compound used? Davies' eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The formula was standardized for quality control. Radium salt, zinc sulfide. The recipe is well documented. He was lying. He was either a fool or a gatekeeper. Evelyn suspected the latter. He was too smooth, too prepared. His job was not to preserve history, but to curate it, to maintain the misleading narrative that protected the Foundation's pristine reputation. She saw Finch's words scrawled in her mind. He knows what the new mixture does. Davies or his employers knew too. The entire philanthropic enterprise was built on a foundation of bones, not just of the known Radium Girls, but of the Shadow Girls, whose murders had been the company's darkest secret. As Davies led her to a digital archive terminal and provided her with access to the carefully redacted files, Evelyn felt a palpable sense of being managed, guided away from the truth. She went through the motions, clicking through files she knew were useless, all the while feeling the weight of the real story, the one in her briefcase. As she left the gleaming headquarters, she had the distinct and unsettling feeling of being watched. A black sedan was parked across the street, unobtrusive, but there. It was a classic intimidation tactic. The Sterling Foundation wasn't just protecting a historical reputation. It was actively concealing a crime, and it would do whatever was necessary to ensure that the Shadow Girls remained in the dark. The search for the forgotten women became an obsession, consuming Evelyn's days and nights. The sterile, curated lies of the Sterling Foundation had only strengthened her resolve. She turned away from official corporate records and dove headfirst into the unofficial history Eleanor Vance had provided. In the fragile pages of a 1923 church newsletter from a small Slovak parish, she found a name: Lena Spark. The newsletter mentioned a social gathering and welcomed new members, including Lena, who had recently arrived to work at the watch factory. It was the first independent confirmation that one of the Shadow Girls had existed outside of Finch's ledger. From there, the trail slowly, painstakingly, came together. Using the church's location as a starting point, Evelyn combed through local property records. She found a boarding house owner whose name appeared on the deed for over 50 years. His grandson, an elderly man named Samuel Kozar, still lived in the same town. With a knot of anticipation in her stomach, Evelyn arranged a visit. Samuel's house was small and tidy, filled with the sepia-toned ghosts of the past. He was a man in his late 80s, with watery blue eyes that held a deep, ancestral sadness. When Evelyn mentioned the name Lena Spark, his eyes widened. "That was my grandmother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never met her. My father was just a baby when she left." He explained the family story, the one that had been passed down through generations. Lena had been a vibrant, ambitious young woman who had come to America for a better life. After a year of working at the factory, she had supposedly run off with a salesman, abandoning her husband and infant son. It was a story of shame, a wound the family had never spoken of openly. "My grandfather never believed it," Samuel said, his gaze distant. "He said she wasn't that kind of woman. She loved my father more than anything." But there was no proof. Just silence. Evelyn's heart ached for this family, haunted for a century by a corporate lie. "I don't believe she ran away, Samuel," Evelyn said gently. "I believe she was a victim of the company she worked for. She was one of the Radium Girls." Samuel shook his head. "No, her name was never on the lists. My grandfather checked, years later when the stories came out. They said she never worked there long enough. She worked with a different kind of paint," Evelyn explained, the words tasting like poison. "A stronger, more dangerous kind." Understanding, and a dawning horror, washed over the old man's face. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a small, dusty wooden box. "My grandfather kept these," he whispered, opening it. Inside were a dozen letters, written in Slovak, the paper thin as a butterfly's wing. And nestled in a bed of faded velvet was a small, tarnished silver locket. Samuel opened it. On one side was a tiny, hopeful photograph of his grandmother, Lena, a beautiful young woman with a fearless smile. On the other side was a picture of her husband and their baby son, Samuel's father. Evelyn translated the letters with an app on her phone, her dread growing with each one. They were full of hope at first, the good pay, the excitement of America. Then the tone shifted. She wrote of a persistent toothache. She mentioned being chosen for a special project with a brighter paint that came with a bonus. The final letter was short, dated just a week after the one before it. "The pain in my jaw is terrible," Lena wrote. "Dr. Thorne at the clinic says it is just an infection. But I feel so weak. My bones ache. I hope to feel well enough to write again soon. Kiss our sweet boy for me." There were no more letters. The silence that followed was her death sentence. Dr. Thorne. The name from the letter was a bombshell. A clinic. A doctor. This was the missing link, the mechanism of the cover-up. Lena hadn't just been a victim of the paint. She had been under medical observation by the very people who were poisoning her. The name was the key. Dr. Marcus Thorne. It was not a name that appeared in any of the official U.S. Radium Corporation records or the subsequent court cases. He was another ghost, another secret. Evelyn's research shifted from the victims to the perpetrators. If the Sterling Foundation was the guardian of the crime, and Arthur Roeder the architect, then Dr. Thorne was the executioner. A man of medicine who had betrayed his oath for a paycheck. Evelyn dove into the academic and medical archives of the era, searching for any trace of him. She found him. Dr. Thorne had been a researcher at a prestigious East Coast university, specializing in cellular biology. In 1921, he had published several papers on the effects of radiation on living tissue using animal subjects. His work was considered groundbreaking, if controversial. Then, in 1922, he had abruptly resigned his university position, citing a desire to enter private practice. There was no record of that practice. He had simply vanished from the academic world. Evelyn's intuition screamed that this was no coincidence. Roeder hadn't hired some back-alley physician. He had recruited a top researcher, a man who knew exactly what radium did to the body. The clinic Lena mentioned in her letter became the next focal point. There were no public records of a Thorne clinic. It was likely a private facility, funded off the books. And the one man who would have kept those books was the company president himself, Arthur Roeder. His personal papers, she discovered, had been donated to his alma mater's library upon his death, a final act of reputation laundering. Accessing them would be difficult. While much of the collection was public, the most sensitive materials, financial ledgers, private correspondence, were restricted, available only to approved scholars for specific research. Evelyn crafted her request carefully, framing her project as a study of Roeder's little-known philanthropic activities, a topic innocuous enough to avoid suspicion. After weeks of waiting, her access was granted. The archive was a cold, silent room, the air thick with the scent of aging paper and leather. She was presented with box after box of Roeder's life. Letters to politicians, minutes from country club meetings, blueprints for his mansion. It was a carefully curated portrait of a captain of industry. But Evelyn wasn't interested in the portrait. She was looking for the cracks in the canvas. For 2 days, she meticulously worked her way through financial records, her eyes scanning endless columns of numbers for a single anomaly. And then, late on the second day, she found it. Tucked inside a large ledger detailing acquisitions of real estate was a smaller, separate accounting book. It had no title, no label. It was filled with coded entries, payments to entities listed only by initials. MT Clinical. Phosphory Dev. Subject acquisition. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. She pulled out her copy of Alastair Finch's journal. The tormented scientist, in his methodical paranoia, had documented everything. He had noted the codenames the company used for their secret project. Phosphory was the enhanced phosphor. MT Clinical was Dr. Marcus Thorne's clinic. Subject acquisition was the chillingly bureaucratic term for the bonuses paid to the immigrant women of Control Group B. The payments listed in Roeder's secret book matched the timeline of Lena's letters and Finch's increasingly desperate journal entries. There were payments for medical equipment, specimen disposal, and, most damningly, a recurring payment to Dr. Thorne for observational reports. The amounts were staggering. Roeder hadn't just funded a clinic, he had bankrolled a secret human laboratory. He was paying Thorne not to treat these women, but to watch them die, to document every agonizing stage of their decay for a purpose that was becoming terrifyingly clear. Finch's journal mentioned Roeder's interest in the military and commercial applications of the data. They weren't just covering up a workplace hazard. They were weaponizing it, gathering data on radiological poisoning with an efficiency that no animal study could provide. The women of Control Group B were not just victims of negligence. They were human sacrifices on the altar of corporate ambition. Evelyn sat back at her chair, the silence of the archive pressing in on her. The scope of the conspiracy was monstrous. The misleading narrative of ignorance was a deliberate, calculated fiction designed to hide a truth so vile it was almost incomprehensible. She had the proof. She had the names. She had the money trail. The unveiling was about to begin. The pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture of almost unimaginable scientific betrayal. Evelyn knew she had the what, but she needed to fully comprehend the how. The enhanced phosphor was the linchpin of the entire conspiracy. It was the murder weapon. She needed to understand its composition and what made it so much more lethal than the standard radium paint. For that, she needed an expert, someone who could translate Alastair Finch's century-old chemical notations into the stark reality of cellular destruction. She contacted Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation to Marcus, a fact she confirmed twice, a professor of nuclear physics and toxicology at her own university. He was a man who lived in a world of isotopes and decay chains, his mind comfortable with the invisible forces that could both heal and kill. Evelyn laid out the evidence on a table in his lab, copies of Finch's notes, the formula for the special phosphor, and the timeline of the Shadow Girls' rapid decline. Eris studied the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was silent for a long time, tracing the chemical equations with his finger. Good God, he finally breathed, looking up at Evelyn, his face pale. This is diabolical. He walked over to a whiteboard, his initial academic calm replaced by a feverish energy. The standard paint used radium-226, he began, sketching a diagram. Its half-life is 1,600 years. It's an alpha emitter. Once ingested, it settles in the bones, mimicking calcium. The body is irradiated from the inside out, slowly, relentlessly. It's a horrific process, but it can take years for the most severe symptoms, like the sarcomas, to develop. He then pointed to Finch's formula. This enhanced phosphor is something else entirely. Finch's notes are a bit cryptic, but my interpretation is that they weren't just purifying the radium. They were deliberately blending it with another isotope, one that Finch only identifies by its decay signature. Based on his data, I believe it was polonium-210. Evelyn felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. Even she knew that name. It was a notoriously potent poison. Polonium-210 is also an alpha emitter, Eris continued, his voice grim, but it is hundreds of times more toxic by weight than radium-226. Its half-life is only 138 days. A mixture like this, it wouldn't just settle in the bones. It would create a cascade of immediate, systemic damage. The alpha particles would be released with ferocious speed. It would shred DNA, destroy bone marrow, cause rampant internal hemorrhaging. The necrosis Finch describes, the jawbones turning to mush in a matter of months, not years, this would do it. He stepped back from the board, looking at Evelyn with a new, profound respect and horror. This wasn't an accident, Dr. Reed. This wasn't negligence. This was a finely tuned weapon. They were creating a compound to maximize tissue damage in the shortest possible time. They turned those women into walking laboratories to establish a dose-response curve for acute radiological poisoning. The motive, which had been lurking in the shadows of Finch's journal, was now thrown into stark, ugly relief. In the 1920s, the world was fascinated by the power of the atom, not just for luminous paint but for medicine and, most lucratively, for warfare. A company that could precisely document the effects of radiation on the human body, that could say this much will kill in this much time, would hold invaluable data. That data could be sold to governments, to militaries, to anyone looking to understand or weaponize the new atomic science. The Shadow Girls weren't just forgotten victims. They were the unpublished results of the most monstrous clinical trial in American history. They were writing a manual on how to kill people with radiation, Evelyn said, the words feeling heavy and obscene in her mouth. And they used those women as the paper and ink, Eris finished, his voice barely a whisper. The conversation left Evelyn shaken to her core. The abstract evil of the ledgers had now been made terrifyingly concrete. She could almost see it. Dr. Thorne in his sterile clinic, observing Lena Spark, not as a patient, but as a data point, his pen scratching in his notebook as the polonium blend did its horrific work. The corporation hadn't just let the girls die. It had engineered their deaths with scientific precision. And the Sterling Foundation, with its gleaming headquarters and philanthropic mission, was the living, breathing legacy of that monstrosity. Evelyn now held all the evidence she needed. It was a chain of damnation, each link forged in a different archive, a different testimony. There was Finch's ledger, the confession from the heart of the conspiracy. There were the names of the Shadow Girls, resurrected from the oblivion of forgotten records. There was Samuel's story, the human cost of a corporate lie. There was Roeder's secret accounting book, the money trail that funded the horror. And now, there was the scientific analysis of the murder weapon itself. The accepted narrative of the Radium Girls was about to be rewritten, not with an eraser, but with a sledgehammer. The Sterling Foundation was no longer just a hurdle in her investigation. It was the final boss. Its entire existence was a monument to a cover-up. Their polished history, their philanthropic endeavors, their carefully managed reputation, it was all a wall built to hide the tomb of the Shadow Girls. She knew what she had to do. A quiet leak to the press would be dismissed as conspiracy. A lawsuit would be buried in litigation for years. The truth had to be confronted directly. She needed to face the beast in its lair. She called Mr. Davies at the foundation, her voice calm and professional, betraying none of the storm raging inside her. "I've concluded my initial research, Mr. Davies," she said. "But I have some follow-up questions regarding Arthur Roeder's collaboration with the Dr. Marcus Thorne. I'd like to meet again, to ensure my work is accurate." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. The name was a key she had not possessed during their first meeting. It was a signal that she knew more than she should. "Dr. Thorne?" Davies's voice was strained, the easy confidence gone. "I'm not familiar with that name in our records." "I'm sure you're not," Evelyn replied coolly. "That's why we need to talk. I'll be at your headquarters tomorrow at 10. It was not a request. As she drove to the foundation the next morning, the black sedan was there again, pulling out from a side street to follow her at a discreet distance. They knew she was a threat. The thought, which once might have frightened her, now fueled her. She wasn't just Evelyn Reed, medical historian. She was an avenger for Lena, for Anya, for all the names in Finch's ledger. She was the voice they had been denied for a century. The atmosphere inside the Foundation was different this time. The air of welcoming transparency had been replaced by a palpable tension. The smiles from the reception staff were brittle. Davies met her not in the public museum, but in a stark, private conference room on an upper floor. The room had a single, large mahogany table and a wall of smoked glass that looked out over the pristine campus. It felt like an interrogation room. "Dr. Reed," Davies began, forgoing any pleasantries. "I'll be blunt. The Foundation has been made aware of your unorthodox research methods. We've been contacted by several archives regarding your inquiries. And we've been made aware that you are in possession of a ledger, which is the stolen private property of this institution's predecessor." The threats had begun. Evelyn calmly opened her briefcase and laid out her files on the polished table, creating her own arsenal of evidence. "This ledger, Mr. Davies," she began, her voice steady and clear, "is not a record of property. It is the testimony of a witness to a crime. A crime this Foundation has spent nearly a century concealing." Davies scoffed, a weak, theatrical sound. "This is absurd. You're a historian peddling a fantasy. The U.S. radium story is a matter of public record." "I agree," Evelyn said, pushing a file across the table. "So, let's talk about the public record. Let's talk about Lena Spark, Anya Nowak, and the 24 other women on this list. Women who worked at your factory, who disappeared, and whose existence you have systematically erased from your transparent history." Davies stared at the list of names, his face a mask of practiced denial, but a vein pulsed in his temple. "These names mean nothing. Boarding house records and church newsletters are not evidence." Evelyn pushed a second file toward him. "Then let's talk about this." It was a copy of the page from Arthur Roeder's private ledger, the coded payments to MT Clinical. Beside it, she placed a copy of Lena Spark's last letter. She underlined the name, Dr. Thorne. "Let's talk about the secret clinic Arthur Roeder funded, and the man he paid to watch my subject's grandmother die. Does the name Dr. Marcus Thorne mean nothing to you now, Mr. Davies?" The blood drained from his face. The name, spoken aloud in this sterile room, was a specter he could not wave away. He was cornered, trapped between the documented past and the Foundation's pristine present. His facade of the calm, corporate historian shattered. His face contorted with a flash of rage. "You have no idea what you are meddling with," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "This Foundation does immense good in the world. Cures diseases. Funds scholarships. You want to tear all that down because of something that happened 100 years ago. The good you do now is built on the bones of women you murdered for data," Evelyn retorted, her voice rising with cold fury. "You speak of your Foundation's mission of truth in science. Was it truth in science when Roeder and Thorne created a lethal radioactive cocktail and secretly tested it on poor immigrant girls? Was it truth in science when they documented the rate at which their jaws rotted and their bones crumbled, all for a report on the commercial applications of radiological poisoning?" Every word was a hammer blow against the glass house of his legacy. Davies slumped in his chair, defeated. The fight was gone, replaced by a weary, hollow resignation. He had spent his career as the keeper of a terrible secret, and now, the tomb had been opened. He was silent for a full minute, the only sound in the room the hum of the building's ventilation. Finally, he looked at Evelyn, his eyes empty. "You've won," he said, the words barely audible. "What do you want?" "I want the truth," Evelyn said. "All of it. No more sanitized records. No more lies. A confession. A full, undeniable confession." Davies seemed to age a decade before her eyes. He picked up his phone and spoke a few quiet words. "Bring the Thorne files to the main conference room. All of them." He then stood and, without looking at Evelyn, walked to the smoked glass wall, staring out at the perfect, green lawn below. Arthur Roeder believed he was a patriot, Davies said, his voice flat, speaking more to the glass than to her. He believed the data they were gathering would give America an edge, militarily and scientifically. He saw those women as soldiers in a different kind of war, expendable for the greater good. A few minutes later, a security guard entered with a trolley laden with gray, archival boxes. Each was labeled with a single, chilling title: MT Clinical Study, 1922 to 1925. Davies gestured to them. "This is what you want," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "This is the truth." Evelyn opened the first box. Inside were not just dry reports but patient files, medical files. For Lena Svark, Anya Nowak, all of them. Each file contained Dr. Thorne's clinical, detached notes documenting their weight loss, their blood cell counts, their hair loss. And it contained photographs. Faded, black and white images taken at weekly intervals, documenting the gruesome, rapid decay. The hopeful young women from the boarding house photos transformed into hollow-eyed skeletons, their faces masks of agony. Tucked in the final box was the summary report, bound in black leather, addressed to Arthur Roeder himself. It was titled, "The Efficacy of an Enhanced Radiophosphor Compound in Accelerating Pathological Necrosis in Human Subjects." It was the confession, the cold, scientific, monstrously frank blueprint of their crime. Evelyn looked from the horrifying photographs to Davies's back. The philanthropy, the good works, it was all penance. It was a billion-dollar wall of atonement, built to hide a truth so ugly they could never allow it to see the light of day. The aftermath was an earthquake. Evelyn didn't leak the story. She detonated it. Working with a team of investigative journalists from a major newspaper, she laid out the entire, meticulously documented case. The publication of the Thorne files, including the horrifying photographs and the final report to Roeder, sent shockwaves around the world. The story of the Radium Girls, a tragedy of the past, became a headline-grabbing scandal of the present. The Sterling Foundation crumbled under the weight of its own monstrous history. Its board resigned in disgrace, its assets were frozen, and federal investigations were launched. Mr. Davies, in exchange for his cooperation, provided testimony that sealed the Foundation's fate. The carefully constructed wall of philanthropy and lies was demolished, revealing the rotten tomb it was built to conceal. The public outcry was immense. The Foundation was legally dissolved. A court-appointed trust was established, redirecting its billions not into self-serving PR, but into three critical areas: a massive, no-expense-spared environmental cleanup of all former U.S. radium sites, a permanent fund for research into radiological diseases, and, most importantly, a program to locate and compensate the descendants of all the victims, including the newly discovered Shadow Girls. The historical narrative was irrevocably changed. Textbooks were updated. Documentaries were made. The names of Lena Svark, Anya Nowak, and the 24 other women were finally added to the history books and, more importantly, to the memorials honoring the Radium Girls. Evelyn stood on a brisk autumn day in a small cemetery in Orange, beside a new granite monument. Samuel Kozar was next to her, his frail hand resting on the freshly carved name of his grandmother, Lena Svark. He had tears in his eyes, but for the first time, they were not tears of shame or confusion, but of resolution. "They know her name now," he whispered, his voice thick with a lifetime of unspoken grief. "They know she didn't run away. She was a hero. They were all heroes." Evelyn looked at the list of names, each one a life cut short by a monstrous ambition. Her work was done. The forgotten had been found. The silence had been broken. Her own personal connection, the thought of her great-great-aunt Sophia, had led her down this path, and while she never found a direct link to the New Jersey experiments, the resolution brought a sense of peace. The fight for one group of victims had become a fight for all of them. She thought about the nature of history, how it is not a fixed and static thing, but a living narrative, constantly being shaped and reshaped by power, by secrets, and by those determined enough to unearth the truth. It was a somber reminder that the most respected institutions can hide the darkest secrets, and that progress is often paid for with a currency of human suffering. As the dedication ceremony concluded and the small crowd began to disperse, Samuel approached Evelyn. He pressed the small, tarnished locket into her hand. "She would have wanted you to have this," he said. "You gave her back her name." Evelyn looked down at the locket, its silver now polished and gleaming. She walked to the base of the new monument and gently placed it there, nestled among a small bouquet of flowers. The sun caught the silver, and for a moment, it seemed to glow with a light all its own. It was no longer the faint, deadly luminescence of radium, a symbol of a slow and agonizing death. It was a bright, clear gleam of remembrance, a beacon of a truth finally, painstakingly, brought into the light. The women who glowed until they died were finally at peace, their full story told, their memory no longer a ghost, but a permanent, unignorable warning.